So these are definitely exciting times for us. So I wanted to just stop here and see if there are any questions from the audience that you wanted to ask this group. It's hard for me to see. So. Anyone? Bueller?
There we go.
Do you have a question?
Actually, 1 second. We've got a microphone that can go.
Thanks. With so many regulatory barriers, how do you see social and digital shaping and expanding in the global space?
So, Marc, do you want to start?
Carefully, I think is the answer. I think there are many opportunities here, but again, one of the things that we really didn't touch on during this conversation is that one of the things that I think our industry struggles with all the time is not just the content creation and the listening, but also to create mechanisms within their own organizations to be able to support that content creation, to support that distribution, and to ensure that the content that's created is going to be spread in such a way that it's going to meet with the various regulatory requirements. And it gets complex, obviously, when you're talking about a global marketplace. But one of the more interesting things that we've been talking about with POZEN is trying to figure out how to structure this so that it doesn't become a sort of an institutionalized mechanism that we have to break down and restart again. One of the troubles I think that we as organizations have with social media in the pharmaceutical space is that we're still very siloed. Marketing sits in one silo, communications in another, customer service in another, medical information in another. And one of the things that needs to be done to be able to facilitate the appropriate use of this is to break down those and ensure that there is connectivity between those groups and that they're sharing information.
Yeah, and I'd also add that, I think social often seems like such a broad problem that when you compartmentalize it into what social is to a particular program, you can solve those problems on a specific basis. What I mean by that is, social is not just creating a Facebook page for the brand. Social can be distribution, right? So it's leveraging the social environment to share content is a different use of social that we found works very well to get the content out to an audience that makes sense, that can become viral in the way that it needs to. I'm not going to say 20 million people are going to watch it, but if 100,000 of the right people in the right category watch it, that's great. They can still link back and watch that content in a very specific area that's pharma safe. So in that particular case, you're using social for distribution, not as much for the direct conversation that's happening around the content. So I think it's really a tool to apply in different ways.
I mean, so as an outsider, but so running digital globally for PepsiCo, I guess we have a different perspective. But as an outsider, having worked a lot in the pharmaceutical space, this is something I've thought about for a long time. And I actually think that regulation has to change. Because in my mind, I think it's actually negligent for pharmaceutical companies not to listen to what consumers are saying. Because what I would ask is how many adverse events could be identified that could have stopped, and so to allow us to have an entire industry be able to close their minds off to it, to me sounds crazy. But I think the big problem is that lawmakers are not as comfortable with the technologies to create real regulation around it that will actually help drive the industry forward. So I hope that all changes, but I don't see a way for it to not. So that's my thought. Sorry.
Well, I think you actually nailed exactly what I was going to say. I think we're all going to be surprised by how quickly we look back on this era and realize how foolish the whole thing was. Yeah. The mere idea that anyone, not to mention a government agency, is going to regulate the ecosystem. Look at what's happening in Iran and Syria. I mean, these things are not prone to regulation. And I think that the idea that somehow it's going to be modulated, it's just not going to happen.
Well, and again, I think the customer, the patient, the person is going to demand that.
That's
and when you go and you can talk to Gatorade or to get information about Gatorade, but you can't get that same sort of information about your health, there's going to be, first of all, you're going to blame the company, but there's going to be some kind of major reaction here.
Absolutely.
I keep thinking, what would happen if we had another Vioxx moment today? Yep. Would the companies be prepared to be able to respond in an appropriate way?
We saw it on Twitter, but we weren't listening because we didn't want to have to report it. Sorry.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah, I just have a question about, back here, I have a question about Gatorade. When you see something out in the social space, do you respond to that in real time, like this question of responsiveness? And then for the other panelists, how might that work in healthcare?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So Gatorade Mission Control, it's a room. It's also got 5 people, cross-functional, that sit in the room, and that's what they do all day long. They listen and engage with consumers in real time. And it all depends on what the conversation is. We got really laser focused on listening to who actually matters to the business. So when I first came in, 80% of the conversation was around hangover cures, and it was like, okay, well, that doesn't really, there's just not enough alcoholics to drive the business. So we said, well, who matters? And it was elite athletes, sideline moms, and athletic directors. And so we listened to them, and those are the conversations we listen to and that primarily get responded to, but it is all in real time.
I think in terms of kind of adapting that, what we're seeing a lot within the companies is ultimately your expectations of service or response for a lot of things. If you're talking about kind of straightforward service expectations, I think a lot of companies have found that it's not necessarily that different from what you're doing via the old 800 number. And can you start to implement those same kind of funnels within the organization to account for some of the social media interactions that are happening? I think some, I don't know from within, but I've heard some companies be surprised that it wasn't the volume we thought it would be, and it can follow very similar funnels to what we had set up already.
The dilemma for the pharma industry with social media, as I see it, is that it really comes down to what the feedback loop is. For you, Bonin, or for a Nike, or for a classic CPG, you can hear something and then very quickly modulate the messaging, the channel, and in many cases the product itself, in the case of software or CPG. In the case of pharma, when you look at the fact that the mere approval process for a new piece of copy can be months, and the development of a drug can be a decade, your ability to have a feedback loop is highly diminished. Yep. So I would actually say what I hope isn't controversial. I don't think that's going to work for the pharma industry. I think social media is going to continue to be in the concept of a projection-based message, I think it's going to be very difficult for the industry to use social media. I think social media is going to be more selective. For the organizations that have a good fortune of having a message that intrinsically is valuable and resonates with their target audience, which I think is a unique situation with POZEN, I think social media is a huge force multiplier. But if you're trying to differentiate between 2 late-to-market drugs, social media has a remarkable ability to differentiate and tear it apart. And in the end, you'll find out that you've not just wasted a fair amount of money, you'll find that you've created a fair amount of ill will among consumers, among healthcare providers. Sees through the social media really does see through those sort of variations at that granularity.
Yeah, I'd also just say that I think there's a huge opportunity still in the unbranded space, which is not as heavily regulated, to create vertical properties that can be much more socially leaning than in the branded side. I think these can be assets for companies if they're trying to build out verticals like cardiovascular or diabetes. That can be enhanced by a lot of the partnerships that are happening on the media side now. So I would just say, while we solve the bigger problem here, which is to figure out the way that we can listen across the entire continuum, there are great opportunities in the unbranded side to start leaning forward now.
So great. Well, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you all for coming here today, and I want to thank our Digital Advisory Board. It continues to be an exciting experience, and they're very helpful, and hopefully you'll get the opportunity to chat a bit more with each of them and on your journeys to change the pharmaceutical model. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.